My name is Martha Blackstall. This is my 10th year as a board member of the Arts Council of Anne Arundel County. And I want to welcome you all to this DEIA lecture and just give you a little tiny bit of history on the Arts Council's work with DEIA. Some years ago, the management and the board realized that the Arts Council had a really important role to promote the DEIA agenda and to incorporate it into our programs. We set up a DEI task force, and I was appointed as the head of that task force. We thereby began to change the way we looked at and organized the Annie Awards, the grants programs, and the educational programs, which are our three principal activities. We have other activities as well. But we became extremely committed, as most of you know, to the leadership role that Anne Arundel County Arts Council could play in promoting DEIA. This series of lectures is a good example of what we're trying to do as part of our education program, as well as our forthcoming conference on August 18th at the Chesapeake Arts Center, which is a fabulous conference, and we're really encouraging people in the arts community in the county to attend, including board members when you can get them. It is a free conference for all attendees, as all of our educational activities are, and we're thinking that we're unlikely to award grants to arts groups that don't attend our free educational activities if they're asking for funding to carry out similar programs on their own. So we really think it's important that people participate in this set of educational activities on DEI, which we are promoting. The August 18th conference will give the chance to staff and board members connect with other organizations and build partnerships that could benefit everyone. So please tell your staff and your board members to try and come to this free conference. I wanted to take this opportunity also to thank the ACDS, the Arundel Community Development Services Program, for financially supporting many of our DEI activities, including our DEIA conference. Thank you, ACDS. We also appreciate our cooperation with our other partners. Angela Wilson from the AngelWing project, who is helping us, who's helped organize this lecture and many of our conference activities. Let me turn the meeting over to her now to introduce our speakers so we can address today's important lecture on exploring microaggressions. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Martha, and good morning, everyone. I'm Angela Wilson of the AngelWing project, and I just would like to welcome everyone again to this conversation today, and all of those who have been coming to these conversations. Hope you have enjoyed and found them very informative. And today we're having another rich conversation exploring microaggressions. And so I just want to introduce very quickly our speakers so we can get started. We have with us today Pete Hill. He is the Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. He is a resident of, and this is with Anne Arundel County. So he is a resident of Glen Burnie, and he is actually Anne Arundel County's first Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And in this role, he is working on a county-wide EDI strategy that will be the roadmap for department and government-wide equity action plan implementation. And prior to joining the county executive's office, Pete served as Equal Opportunity and Diversity Management Director for the National Weather Service. And there he developed and deployed diversity and equal opportunity training programs for more than 4,000 employees. And he has also held diversity data and equal opportunity roles with the National Labor Relations Board and the Department of Homeland Security, and served in the U.S. Army Signal Corps for 21 years prior to his career in federal government. So he has a wealth of knowledge to share with us today. And so assisting him today is Asha Smith, She is an attorney and human resources professional with a wealth of compliance experience in federal, state, and local equal opportunity and disability laws. And her experience includes developing and implementing policy, investigating and resolving internal complaints, facilitating training, providing advice to senior personnel. And most recently, she was the senior management of EEO, Equal Opportunity Employment, and ADA compliance at Anne Arundel County Public Schools. And she oversaw, or she managed discrimination and harassment concerns. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Pete Hill and Asha.
Thank you so much for that, and thank all of you for joining us today. At this time, I'm going to share my screen, hopefully successfully. Can everyone see where it says learning objectives? If so, just give me a thumbs up. All right. Over the course of the next 45 minutes or less, I want to talk to you about the history of microaggressions, some types of microaggressions, intent versus impact as it relates to microaggression, and last but not least, what allyship looks like with respect to microaggressions. So let's start with the history. Chester Pierce was a Harvard University tenured professor back in the 1960s. And he was the first person to coin the term microaggressions. And he did that for a very particular reason. He was trying to encapsulate what it was he and his African-American colleagues were experiencing in institutions of higher learning, as well as society writ large. And so he termed it microaggressions. Right on the heels of the civil rights movement came the American feminist movement in the 1970s. So we would be remiss then if we didn't talk about the woman who took the term microaggression and added a new term to it, micro inequities. That would have been Dr. Mary Rowe from MIT University around about 1973. In the year 2007, Dr. Darrell Sue organized microaggressions into 3 different categories. And so I want to talk about all of those things throughout this lecture. Dr. Kevin Nadel is the guy who gave us the modern definition, the one that we use today in terms of microaggressions. Take a moment, if you will, to look at the modern definition of microaggressions, keeping in mind the origins of the term dealt specifically with African Americans. But this is what he now says that microaggressions consist of. As you're looking at that definition, I want to highlight a single word. The word is subtle. At the end of this presentation, I want to relate that word subtle to what I call a paradigm shift in how we view or should view microaggressions. Everyday, subtle, intentional, and or oftentimes unintentional behaviors or interactions that communicate some form of bias toward historically marginalized groups. Now, the question becomes, when I say that, if you are a white male listening to that definition, historically marginalized groups sounds like it could be exclusive of white males. I can assure you it is not. If you are a white male and you happen to be in the LGBTQ community, perhaps you're a white male and you belong to a religion that has been historically marginalized. And so I can assure you microaggressions applies to everybody within the sound of my voice. But what are the characteristics then of microaggressions? Microaggressions can be characterized in 3 different categories: behavior, environment, as well as verbal. If you're taking a look at the definition on the screen, I want you to read that for a moment, and then I want to provide some examples of each. 3 different categories or characteristics, if you will, of microaggressions: behavior, environmental, and verbal. A good example of a behavioral microaggression is when a waiter or a bartender ignores a transgender person and instead serves a person whose biological sex matches their apparent gender identity. When it comes to environmental microaggression, another characteristic, environmental example is when a college campus only has buildings named after white males. And last but not least, a good example of a verbal characteristic is someone saying, "You're so smart for a woman." Three characteristics of microaggressions are behavioral, environmental, and verbal. Now, some of you may have questions, but because of the short duration of this lecture, I would ask that you please write down your questions. And then at the end, I am more than happy, or Asha would be more than happy to address whatever concerns you may have. Now, earlier I mentioned that there were three types of microaggressions. A moment ago, we talked about the characteristics, but what are the types of microaggressions, according to Dr. Sue? Micro assaults, micro insults, and micro invalidations. Dr. Darrell Wing Sue and his colleagues have defined all three of these as forms of microaggressions. So let's take a look first at what a micro assault looks like. Micro assaults are normally intentional and they are abusive in terms of language. And an example of a micro assault could be when you get in an elevator as an African-American male, such as myself, and the person in the elevator begins to clutch their purse tighter because they presume that I remind them of a criminal. When you're around certain people that are posting offensive signs or pictures intentionally, you take a look at the picture on this slide. If you were of the Muslim faith, this would be considered a micro assault against your religion. That is an example of a non-verbal. The one I gave you in the elevator was another non-verbal example of a micro assault. But keep in mind, micro assaults can be verbal or non-verbal. Micro insults. Take a look at that definition. Micro insults. Again, like its micro assault counterpart, micro insults can be verbal or non-verbal. For example, if you're African American, once again, somebody could say to you, "Well, Pete, you don't sound Black." Or they could say to someone who looks foreign to them, "No, where are you from really?" After they've told you they're from Texas. Or you look at somebody who you assume should speak Spanish, and when they say to you, "I only speak English," you then say, "So you don't speak Spanish?" Non-verbal forms of micro insults includes, for instance, graffiti painted on a Vietnamese store that says, "Go back to where you came from." These are all forms of either a verbal or a non-verbal form of a micro insult. The last one I want to talk about in terms of the different types of microaggression is a micro invalidation. This occurs when a person comment invalidates or undermines the experiences of a marginalized group. A good example of that is telling women that sexual harassment complaints simply blow things out of proportion, or saying that Blacks should just get over slavery because, after all, didn't that happen over 100 years ago? Or perhaps you said to a member of the LGBTQ plus community that they have no right to be demanding that society accepts them for who they are. These are all forms of invalidating who people are at their core. Microaggressions, three different types: assaults, and we ended here with invalidations. Now, the other thing about microaggressions, and this is the part that is so insidious, microaggressions can be and often are unconscious. Why are they unconscious? Because of the books we read, the movies we watch, the family that raised us, the neighborhoods we grew up in. We have been conditioned to just accept certain things. For example, when you walk up to somebody, again, who may look foreign to you, and they begin to speak, and you say, "You speak English so well." To that person, that may be a form of a microaggression. "You're transgendered. Wow, you don't look like it at all." In your mind, you may have been giving them a compliment. In their mind, you just insulted them. My all-time favorite is the last bullet on the right, since it has impacted me personally. "He's from the South. What did you expect?" So again, these are things you may say that in your mind were harmless, but to the other person who overheard it or may be victimized by what you said, it is a really big deal. So I want you to just take a moment and look at some of the other statements up here and see if any of them resonate with you personally, or perhaps you have said them and hurt someone unintentionally. Just take a moment and look over those bullets. And this list is not exhaustive, by the way. There's many more things that could be added. One of the things we like to talk about is intent versus impact. Intent versus impact. So what is the difference between the two? Intent, that is how you think or feel. Impact is how your actions make another person feel. So it doesn't matter what you were thinking at the moment. So what you said was, fill in the blank. The problem is on the right, it's what they heard. On the left, you may have meant to say, but on the right, you made them feel a particular way that you perhaps did not intend. Your intent was not to offend, so you tell yourself, yet your words came across as insensitive at best to the so-called target. Your intent was to convey a compliment, for instance, yet the target thinks that you are socially illiterate or uninformed. This is the danger of microaggressions, that sometimes as we go through our day, we say or do things that we had no intentions of hurting others, but because we may be uninformed, we end up doing so unintentionally. But whether it's unintentional or intentional, if you are the target of that language or that behavior or that environment, it doesn't make you feel any better, whether it was intentional or unintentional. At this time, I want you to take a moment and just think to yourself, if you've gone about your day, whether it's today, yesterday, or days beyond yesterday, what might you have done or said that you did not intend to hurt someone, but you did? And if you are willing to share that with us, if you could just type some of the things that either you have been the target of or you have been accused of in terms of a microaggression, that your intent was one thing, but the person responded differently. Any brave souls that would like to type something in the chat box to let us know something you may have experienced as either the microaggressor or the target of a microaggression. Intent versus impact. You were thinking and feeling one thing, and the other person felt a different way. Asha, as you may recall, I can't see the chat box, so if you would be so kind as to monitor that for me, I would appreciate it.
Sure, I'm watching it, Pete. Thank you.
I am too. Yep.
Anyone have been accused of a microaggression or perhaps has been the target of a microaggression?
I'll speak up. I'm Nicole from Chesapeake Arts Center. I get a lot of, because I'm heavily tattooed, that I am a bad person or a criminal or completely opposite of who I am because of what is on my body.
And Nicole, unfortunately for us, again, depending on what generation you grew up in, say for instance, millennials and Generation Z are less likely to be critical of those types of tattoos as say my generation, Generation X, or my mother's, baby boomers, would be more critical because that was considered in the workplace at one time to be unprofessional.
Mm-hmm. We also have a comment from Martha Blackstell. This morning, eating breakfast at our hotel in New York, a nearby visitor asked my husband what his profession was. Never asked me. We are both PhD professionals, but I was the wife, not as seen as a professional.
Once again, the way we have been conditioned, depending on your culture, men are considered in positions of authority. Women are normally seen as something less than, irrespective of what their actual college education may be. We make assumptions based on how we have been cultured. Anyone else cares to share? Intent versus impact. Somebody gave you a compliment, or at least they thought it was a compliment, but you thought, wow, really?
Yes, I've been told that I was very articulate or that I speak very well. And yeah, intending to give me a compliment, but I didn't take it that way.
So Angela, let's explore that for a moment, if you don't mind. When you listen to those words, Angela, the words in and of themselves sound positive, don't they?
Yes.
You speak so well or articulate. Why would that be offensive to you personally, if you don't mind sharing?
Well, at this particular time, I had done a presentation. A lot of people had not heard me speak in this role that I was in, and just that they were so surprised bothered me. Mm-hmm. Why would you be surprised that that I was able to do this presentation the way I did it and was able to, to present it professionally and well worded, or, whatever it was that they meant by, but the surprise of their reaction did not feel complimentary to me.
Exactly. For me, just to share two things. One, typically I have to wear a suit and tie for my job. And when I'm off campus, say shopping, going to a restaurant, whatever it may be, and somebody may walk up to me, particularly people in my own community, African Americans, and they always say, "Man, you look nice. Are you a preacher?" But they never assumed that I could be an executive or CEO or anything of that nature. A well-dressed Black man in their mind, these are people who look like me, I might add, but they only assume that I am a member of the clergy. Why would that be? And why would I not be offended by that? When I tell people I hail from the God-fearing state of Mississippi, after they've heard me give a presentation or whatever, they say to me, "Man, I never would have guessed you were from Mississippi." Why do we say things like that? Why do we do things like that? Again, I would submit that microaggressions, when we call them unconscious, they truly are in some instances. And again, if we do not understand unconscious bias at its root, which is how we are conditioned to think through our environment, through the families that raise us, the books we read, the movies we watch, the friends we keep, all of these things will condition us to become immune to the things we are saying, which is why we are normally shocked and surprised when the target of what we said points out to us, "Hey, that was offensive to me." We're shocked, I tell you, because in our minds, we said nothing wrong. So how do we address microaggressions? People often ask me that question, and here's what I say. First thing you want to do if you truly want to address microaggressions microaggressions, you want to check for awareness. And what do I mean by that? I'm talking about emotional intelligence. You're not only checking for your self-awareness, what did I say? What was my intent? And what was the impact? But you're checking for the awareness of others. When I said what I said, what body language did I notice? What was their response? Because if you're not aware of your surroundings in that discussion, you may offend someone, and because of your power or perceived power, they won't say anything to you. But when they leave that conversation, they're going to leave there feeling offended and powerless. Check for awareness. Address the specifics. This is referring to you if you were the target of a perceived microaggression. Hey, Pete, when you said, I look beautiful for a Black woman, I know you meant for that to be a compliment, but by adding Black woman, what did you mean by that? So you want to specify what offended you. Keep in mind, most people are going to be two things: shocked and surprised when you point out to them the perceived microaggression. Once you point out the specificity, the next thing you have to do, if you were the alleged target, is you want the alleged aggressor to have an opportunity to explain why they said or did what they did. You have to be willing to listen to their explanation. And you want to use that moment to educate and not criticize. And last but not least, what I would say to you is that if you are either offended or you are the one who did the offense, you must be willing, once it's pointed out, brought to your awareness, to demonstrate empathy. Empathy is not the same as sympathy. Empathy simply means that I'm taking a moment to reconsider what it is I said, and I'm considering, was there an alternative that I failed to take? Those are some small ways that you can address microaggressions. Here are some things you should not do in terms of microaggression. Take a moment and look at that screen, please. Our natural instinct, sometimes, for some of us, is to immediately accuse people of being discriminatory, depending on what the microaggression was. We go to the negative. We do not assume that they did this based on an unconscious bias, that we assumed it was intentional, and we're going to let them have it. The other thing you don't want to do is to refuse to listen to that person's explanation. Because remember, they may have done this unintentionally. Something I definitely highly recommend that you do not do is to remain silent. I believe what Homeland Security says about airports. See something, say something. Never ever allow the perceived aggressor to go unchallenged. Why? There's two reasons I can think of minimum. Number one, you're losing out an opportunity to educate that person, to raise to their level of consciousness something that they may be doing unintentionally, but yet it is offensive to an entire group of people, women, people of color, people with disabilities, white men who may happen to be in the LGBTQ plus community, etc. The second reason why you don't want to let it go unchallenged is if they got away with it with you, they may do it to someone else. And that someone else might be on the verge of a mental breakdown already, for all we know. Mental health, after all, is a big issue, not only in the workplace, but in society at large. And so if you allow that person to go unchallenged, you never know who they may come up to next, and they might not be able to handle it the way you did. Last but not least, if you feel unsafe or you fear retaliation, always consider involving a third party. Hey, Pete, Asha really said something that offended me, but because she's my supervisor, I don't feel comfortable enough to say something to her. I know you and her are good friends and you're on the same level. Do you mind saying something to her? because this is really bothering me and I don't feel safe. If you do not feel safe, you should never approach the aggressor or the perceived aggressor if you do not feel safe. But do not allow that person, when possible, to go unchallenged. Always seek a third party. So how do you respond when it comes to other people coming to you about a microaggression that they may be suffering? What can you do? What should you do? Well, I would argue that you should be an ally. Take a look at those things that an ally can do. As an ally, you walk up on somebody who says something, and you can tell that the target is afraid or doesn't feel safe to respond. One of the things they encourage you to do is to say something as simple as, "Pete, what makes you say that?" And it forces Pete to have to repeat what he just said and now consider an alternative. If you raised to his level of awareness that he might have said something that offended someone, but you did it in such a manner that Pete did not feel threatened. I don't get it. Can you explain the joke to me? This occurs when you walk up on a joke that you know is offensive to somebody in the group, but that somebody did not feel safe enough to say, "I'm offended by the African-American jokes you're telling." Maybe I'm a new employee and I'm on probation and I really need this job. So I'm willing to suck up that microaggression to keep my employment. But because you are an outstanding ally and you want to work in a culture where that type of behavior is not accepted, you would be that person that says, "I don't get it. Can you explain the joke to me?" And force me to have to repeat it, but now consciously. Again, all of these different bullets you see here are different ways that you can become an ally simply through addressing the so-called aggressor. Allies must be willing to mediate the situation by seeking to understand the aggressor, not accuse him or her, not shaming them, but seeking clarity. Because think about it, any of us, most of us, in fact, I would consider all of us, do not like it when people attack our character. We respond to change better when we understand that need for change. And so if you're going to be an ally, always address the aggressor with the spirit of teaching, not criticizing. Last thing I want to say before we go into our Q&A session is I want to talk about a paradigm shift. You know, when we hear the term microaggression, first of all, think about it. When you learn the word micro, most of us associate that word with tiny, small. When we hear the word aggression, we think of something terrible, bad, it's negative in nature. But what if what you did was unintentional, the so-called aggressor? What if what you suffered is not a small thing to you? Just get over it. Maybe small to you, but the person you're telling to get over whatever it is you want them to get over, they see it as large. And so the authors of this book, Subtle Acts of Exclusion, Jana and Barron, as I recall, they wrote a book where they're saying we should change how we look at microaggressions. Language matters. That they're saying we should replace the term microaggression with a new term, subtle acts of exclusion. Subtle differs from the word micro. If you think about the word subtle, that's exactly what's happening. It's not so big that everybody would have recognized it. It may be just big enough that you, the target, recognized it and felt it. But it was so small that the perpetrator didn't get what you felt. So they're saying, instead of saying micro, say subtle. We know it is something that you did or felt, so it's an act. And last thing, they're saying it's about exclusion. That when you say and do the things that you're doing that we used to call microaggressions, it was an attempt to exclude someone. And so they're saying, and this is a whole nother class in and of itself, subtle acts of exclusion. So we don't have the time to get into it today, but I highly recommend this book to all of you who are truly interested in eliminating microaggressions from your life, particularly in the workplace. Subtle acts of exclusion. So with that, I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to talk about microaggressions. So I want to thank you for listening to what I had to say. I kind of condensed this class for the sake of the time frame they gave me. I want to thank you for paying attention. And I want to ask you at this time, do you have any questions, comments, or concerns?
Thank you, Mr. Hill, for that. If anyone has questions, if you just want to raise your hand, I can call you guys.
Can you unshare your screen now so we can see
Yes, indeed.
everyone?
There you go.
Are there any questions?
So I do have a question, or I don't know if it's a question or just a thought, but a lot of times people say things because they are uninformed. They don't have the experience that someone else has. So for instance, I walked in on a conversation at a previous workplace, and it was about, it was a protest that turned into looting and things like that. This was around the time of Freddie Gray, the situation with Freddie Gray happened in Baltimore. And so these were two colleagues of mine who were talking about the incident, and they just could not understand the reaction of the African-American community, or what they saw as the African-American community, with the looting and some of the things that happened in the aftermath. So they couldn't understand, so not knowing, so sometimes it's like, I don't understand because I don't understand the history. I don't understand where this is coming from. So I just kind of asked them if I could say something, if they didn't mind if I said something. And I just tried to give them a little bit of like, this is like a historical, this is not just one incident. This is something that has happened over and over. And the outrage is coming from like built up, rage and everything like that. I just tried to help them understand a little bit. But would that be considered a microaggression in terms of, I'm having this conversation, but I'm really uninformed. I'm not trying to hurt anybody. I'm trying to just have a harmless conversation, but I just don't understand this because this hasn't been my experience. Does that make sense?
It does, Angela. I want to tell you what I think I understood. So when you walked up on this conversation and heard it, in that instance, you felt that you were the target of a microaggression because you belong to this particular community that they're talking about, and that you felt that if they had knowledge of the history of this group of people, then maybe that would change their minds about how they considered what they were looking at. What was the reason why these people were destroying, for all intents and purposes, their own neighborhood, right? That you felt that even though I initially was the target of an aggression because I overheard something, I'm going to take this moment and attempt to educate. And then you felt, now maybe I'm becoming the aggressor because I'm trying to take this moment to teach them something, but they seem to be unwilling to hear what I have to say. Am I still on track? Angela, am I still on track?
Yes. I mean, they just were like, okay, yes.
Fair enough. Here's what I would say to you and the entire audience. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. in this instance, you did everything that I just taught in this class, right? Which is do not make the assumption of ill intent. You should first seek to educate, which is exactly what you attempted to do, right? But if they are not willing to listen to the alternative, remember I talked about, is there an alternative? That was their opportunity to raise their level of awareness that maybe I insulted Angela unintentionally. So I can go from being a perceived aggressor to an ally. Hey, Angela, I never looked at it that way before. You know, where I grew up, we'd always been taught that when people do these types of things, they're called hoodlums, rioters, thugs. So when I looked at what I saw on TV, those were the adjectives that came to mind. But thank you for enlightening me. Now, when I see the same type of stuff, I will have a different perspective. This person would have evolved. They would have leaned on empathy, and they now place themselves in the condition in which you explained to them. But if they refuse to do that, Angela, you now have two options. You can give up and move on, or you can disengage from that conversation and seek a new opportunity outside of that environment to re-engage. But remember what I said, we should never let these things go unchallenged. That if you don't feel safe, you should seek out an ally. Maybe you can't break through. Perhaps there were some people that were their colleagues that were already allies, and you are aware of those people. You could go to them and say, hey, do you mind? And you explain the situation. And maybe if they hear it from that person, they have an aha moment. Does that make sense, Angela?
Yes, thank you.
Are there any other questions, comments, or concerns about anything that you learned here today about micro assaults, micro insults, micro invalidations, the history of the word microaggression, how it started with Charles Pierce at Harvard University way back in 1968 on the heels of the Civil Rights Movement. It then evolved to include women during the feminist movement of 1973. And ultimately, Dr. Sue, an Asian American, started looking at all of the different ways that his community were receiving microaggressions. And so this has continued to evolve even as we are speaking right now.
Does anyone have any other questions? I personally feel right now at this time, there's a lot of division and a lot of microaggression language being presented through social media or just in conversation, because we're so divided right now, that you automatically say things that you might not meant that way, and then defense happens real quick and it snowballs into something bigger very quickly. I see it more on social media, but it's very, it catches up very quick. And then everyone, like, I feel attacked, they feel attacked. And then how do you move on from that? Of trying to understand each other instead of like the empathy coming in and understanding where that person's coming from. We quickly put up that wall and say, this is my way of how I feel about it. Do you feel that you're seeing it more now because of division, or this has always been very heated, always?
So before I respond, I want to give my good colleague, Asha Smith, an opportunity to jump in if she so desires, but I would love to address that.
Sure, go ahead, Pete.
So what I would say is, it's not that I'm seeing it any more or any less. It's kind of like police brutality. It has always existed, but when it was first video recorded in the 1990s with the Rodney King beating, until now, as technology has gotten better with iPhones, et cetera, it now feels as if there's more police brutality because we are exposed to it more, right? Mm-hmm. And so when it comes to social media, it is allowing us to be globally connected to people all around the state, all around the nation, all around the world. So it makes it look as if this problem has gotten exponentially bigger. But has it? What I will say about social media, it makes addressing microaggressions more difficult. Because now I can simply log off. I don't have to engage you anymore. Whereas if I work with you and we're not teleworking, I have to see you again. That's another opportunity for me to try to engage. But if you're hiding behind the keyboard warrior, as they call them, and you're yelling out snowflake this and snowflake that, and nobody wants to listen to the other person's point of view, then microaggressions will get more and more dangerous, if you will. Because if you stay in your silo and continue to believe the things that you believe, you're more likely to do the things that you would like to do, because there's no countermeasures to what you're listening to. You're only going to visit sites that agree with you. And when you accidentally visit a site, I tell the story in my unconscious bias class that I am a card-carrying liberal, proudly so. Every now and then, as I'm watching MSNBC, I accidentally change channels to Fox News and I lose my mind. Why? Because they have a point of view that doesn't line up with what I choose to believe. Doesn't mean that what I believe is correct. It's just that MSNBC aligns confirmation bias, right? Likewise, social media allows confirmation bias to allow us to continue to do these aggressive things because we're in a silo. There is no opposing view. Because when it shows up, we just disconnect, we block them, we do whatever we do on social media, almost like a kid going, nah, 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 nah. Does that address your concerns, my dear lady? I don't want to move on if you're not satisfied with how we engage.
I think no, it did. Thank you. It did.
Enough.
Yep. Did anyone else have any questions or stories they want to share and talk through? And
that example you gave says that this is not only racial or religious or even economic in terms of microaggressions that can be hurtful, but it's also political. And this conversation here is focused more on race and sex, perhaps, but we're in such a heated political divide environment that people get used to speaking so poorly of the other political side that it may encourage more microaggressions on the other issues. What's your response to that?
My response would be the same, that irrespective of the source of the microaggression, we still must attempt to seek understanding, explain why it is. Remember, we talked about specificity. So let's just say it is politics. Hey, Pete, I'm a card-carrying conservative, and I don't appreciate you constantly berating the greatest president ever, Donald John Trump. That is offensive to me. They provided me with specificity. Now I have a choice to make. Hey, whoever you are, my apology. Those are my political beliefs, and I now understand that in your presence, I should not be saying those things, even though I may believe it. I realize that it may offend you, and I promise you I will no longer do that in your presence. The point I want to make, team, is irrespective of what the subject matter is. A microaggression is like a gunshot wound. Whether you shoot me with a .22 pistol or a .50 caliber machine gun, it's still a gunshot wound. It may be bigger if it's a .50 cal, but it's still a gunshot wound. Microaggressions are still microaggressions, whether we're talking sexuality, gender, race, politics, religion, etc., right? That the way we address them is not going to change, which is engagement. The level of the engagement may differ based on the specificity. You call me the N word, for example, it's not going to be the same as me saying, I love Joe Biden, and you say F Joe Biden, right? It's not going to be the same level of hurt that I'm going to experience as the target. Or your intent will be more serious if you went with something like the N word versus Democrats suck. But the point I'm making is you have to engage with the aggressor, and you need to be able to look through the eyes of the so-called target if you have been called out. What we cannot afford to do is to ignore each other. That is how we got to where we are right now. What do we do different? And if you don't have any questions for me, guess what? I have a few for you because you strike me as the type of people I can learn from. So I like learning and I do not give up opportunities to do so. Can somebody tell me one thing new they heard today that will make a difference in their lives? One thing new that you heard today that may make a difference, not only in your life now that you've heard it, but it could make the difference in someone else's life in case you get to use it. Anyone? Either open up your microphone or drop it in the chat.
I'll speak up. I think what I found really helpful, or what I learned, is just the steps that are needed to deal with either me unintentionally committing a microaggression or seeing it in being done by somebody else, and what my role needs to be and how to actually do that, at least to take those first initial steps. So I think that was really helpful from a process standpoint and from a learning standpoint.
Outstanding. Let's see, we dropped something in the chat box.
We have the phase subtitle acts of occlusion was new for me today, but it was a nice way to reframe my thinking.
Great. Again, we should never miss an opportunity to take away something from any class that you learn. Training is what I do as a trainer. Education is what you're going to do, self-educate, when you leave here. In other words, what did you do with the information I provided? That is when education will take place. I can only provide training. Education is going to be left up to you. The other question that I have for you, there's something else in the chat box?
Well,
Oh, go ahead, Martha.
Okay, I was just going to say, to follow up on what Donna said, that I am frequently in a position where I observe a microaggression. It's not directed towards me, but it may be directed towards my colleague with whom I'm involved. And I've always questioned, how do I respond to that? Do I take that microaggressor on? Do I serve as an ally? Sometimes I can see my colleague sort of tensing, but not wanting to engage in a direct confrontation. In that kind of a situation, you're the ally, but where your colleague does not engage, is it okay if you engage against the person who did the microaggression?
That's a good question, Martha, and I will bring two things to your attention. I used to be what they call an EEO counselor. And one of the things we learned in training was, what do you do if you hear a racist statement, but the person it was directed toward doesn't say anything, but you yourself were offended, even if you're from another race, if that makes sense. So now you got to make a decision, right? So the question becomes, based on the way you presented it, if the target of the microaggressor didn't say anything, I want to be an ally, what should I do next? I would answer with this. There are no such thing, or there is no such thing as an innocent bystander. We're just bystanders. We're never innocent. We always have choices. Look at it this way, Martha. If you were in an airport and you looked down and saw a briefcase that clearly was a bomb, what would you do? It was clearly a bomb. Would you just walk by it and say, ain't my problem? You would probably take some type of action, right? Even if it would just start screaming, but you would do something. Look at microaggressions as a bomb in the airport, ladies and gentlemen. If nothing else, start screaming, because you're going to draw attention to the situation. Pete, what the hell are you screaming for? Now it's an opportunity for me to start talking. But at no time should we do nothing. If you feel unsafe, always look for somebody else who may be safer than you or feel safer than you do to address that person. Asha, were you trying to say something? Okay. One other thing I wanted to say before we run out of time, you can never forget the power dynamic when it comes to microaggression. Supervisors will get away with microaggressions toward employees more often than, say, an employee could get away with it with a supervisor. Can we agree on that?
Mhm.
And think about that for a moment. If that's true, and you are a fellow supervisor, colleague, you now have a responsibility to be policing one another, to making sure that the environment that we are creating is conducive to creativity, productivity, and innovation. Because subtle acts of exclusion and/or microaggressions kill all three of those things. Do you know that people have actually left jobs because of microaggressive behavior? You ever heard the saying, people don't leave organizations, they leave supervisors? Because an organization itself cannot be a microaggressor. The organizations are made up of people. People have titles, and with those titles come power. Lord Acton said it best, and I tend to agree. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We should never allow a microaggressor to have absolute power. See something, say something. And if you're afraid to say something, just scream. Are there any other questions as we begin to wind down? I think we're running out of time here.
Anyone else? I would like to thank you, Mr. Hill and Mrs. Smith, for presenting today. I know I always learn from these. Just a reminder, we have our conference DEIA at the Chesapeake Arts Center on August 18th. Please advise your staff and board to participate. These have been super helpful. I appreciate, again, your time. Any last remarks before we close out? Good.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you for the
Thank
invite.
Thank you.
Nice
Thank
seeing
you,
everyone.
this has been really informative. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.